This is the sleepy time of so everybody go to sleep and, just let me talk and then we'll hopefully wake you up when Howard comes on. That's how we're sort of dividing labor. Okay, so navigating the dissertation process. I want to start with the caveat that honestly, I am very far from being an expert at navigating the dissertation process, right? Like most people, I've done exactly one dissertation in my entire life. And I never want to do another one. And when I look back on the time that I did my dissertation, which I try never to do, I have to admit I made a lot of mistakes, right? Lots of things that I would probably have done differently. And so what I'm going to try and do is actually talk about some of the mistakes that I made and some of the mistakes that I think other people have made, that I've seen make, either my students or my colleagues, and kind of highlight some of the traps that I think people tend to fall into as they go through the dissertation process, in the hope that you can either avoid those traps, or at least as you're falling into them, you can sort of remember and say, yes, Aseem warned me about this and I'm still doing it. So how I thought I'd do this is really sort of think about what's the objective, right? So the objective, the way I see it, is to produce a significant and credible piece of research that on the one hand is acceptable to your committee, and the other hand sets a foundation for future research, and to do that in a reasonable amount of time, right? And what I'm going to do is take each one of the highlighted, sort of blue highlighted sections and talk about the places where people sort of go wrong or maybe fall into traps with each one of those, okay? So I'm going to have 5 traps. Let's start with significant and credible, okay? So you've probably heard this many, many times before, but good dissertation is, in my view, is sort of significant in that it says something new and important to an existing conversation in the field, and it's credible, meaning it has, relevant data, appropriate methods, robust findings, etc., right? And to do this right, you need to get both, right? It's not enough to have credibility, it's not enough to have significance. You need to do both. My own sense is most students do pretty okay on the credible side, especially when they sort of get going, right? I think where a lot of people fall short is on significance, right? So I think the trap 1 is really missing the big picture, right? Also known as missing the wood for the trees, right? So you're probably spending weeks, if not months, collecting your data, coding it, cleaning it, right? And so you eventually get to the point where you're so deeply immersed in your context and the details of your study and in the models you're running, and whether they have 3 stars or 2 stars on the coefficient that you're interested in, you tend to lose sight. It's easy to lose sight of what's the overarching story here, right? What does this all mean? Because your dissertation is not about the fact that you have a great instrument. It's wonderful to have a great instrument, but that's not the contribution from the dissertation. It's not about the fact that, oh my God, like I run it with fixed effects and random effects and it still works, even though that's really cool when it happens. It really is about what can you say, what's the big story, right? And so I think, just regularly stepping away from your data and saying, okay, what does this mean, right? Big picture. So one of the things I did, few things that I did right was I had an outline, right, which came out of my dissertation proposal that I kept updating. And believe me, the outline changed dramatically between my first proposal and my final defense. But at any given point of time, I could give you a 2-page outline of what is my dissertation about. And I think that really helped to sort of say, this is what I'm doing with my dissertation, this is what my findings mean, okay? The second thing I want to highlight is the piece of research, right? And I want to emphasize piece because I think the second trap is what I'm going to call the magnum opus trap, right? Your dissertation is not your life's work, right? It's not your Sistine Chapel, it's not your Ode to Joy, it's not your Finnegan's Wake. Hopefully it really is not your Finnegan's Wake. It's just one piece of work, right? It's not the only thing you're going to do. It's probably, hopefully, actually not the best thing you're going to do, right? It's just the first thing you're going to do. Which means 2 things, right? One, not every single idea, every single question that you've ever thought about has to be part of your dissertation, right? Don't try to put everything in there. Even if you're finding things that, or you think they're interesting questions you can ask with your data set, they don't need to be in your dissertation, right? You can always go back and write other papers after you're done. Just try and get done, right? So don't try to be comprehensive, just try to be coherent, right? Because the other problem is it's not just that you'll never get done, it's also that by putting in all of these different moving parts, you're going to have a dissertation that makes no sense because it's going to be all over the place, right? So try and keep it sort of reasonably coherent, and don't shoot for perfection, right? There's always more data you can collect, there's always more analysis you can run, but the standard for publication, frankly, is not perfection, it's just doing a really good job, right? So as long as you shoot for good enough, don't shoot for perfection. How do you know it's good enough? It needs to be acceptable to your committee. That's probably a good sign, right? And how do you get there? I would say don't manage your committee, right? And what I mean by manage is don't think about, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking of your committee as the enemy, right? These are the guys I have to somehow slide past, right? I have to sort of figure out a way to get past them and just get to the end and be done, right? And I just realized I'm using a football analogy, which is really scary. Anyway, but you know, the analogy actually works, right? Except, believe it or not, your committee is actually on your side, right? It may not seem like that right now, but they are not a bunch of petty-minded sadists whose only purpose in life is to torment you. They are a group of intelligent, experienced researchers who, from the fact that they've agreed to be on your committee, probably like you, almost certainly think you have potential. They wouldn't be doing this to themselves otherwise, right? So use your committee. You know, don't think if I never talk to my committee, they can't tell me what to do, and so I'm going to be safe, right? That's not going to work. Go talk to your committee regularly. Make sure that, you know, get their feedback. That way you'll avoid surprises when you get to the defense. It's not going to be like, wait, I thought you were doing something completely different, which has happened, right? I've been on committees where I'm like, that's not what your proposal said. But also actually pay attention to their suggestions, right? At least acknowledge the possibility that they might have something intelligent to say and that doing this might actually make your dissertations better. Don't just try to sort of say, how can I manage this to make it go away, right? At the same time, use their time wisely, right? Don't show up at their door every second day saying, oh my God, I don't know what to do now. And in particular, you know, expect suggestions, not decisions, right? It's your dissertation. You need to make the decisions, not them. But you can always go to them with potential solutions saying, you know, here are a couple of things I'm thinking about trying, what do you think, right? As opposed to saying, I have no idea what to do with this data set now, nothing works, tell me what to do, right? That's not really going to be, that's not a question a committee member can really answer. But of course, it's not just about making your committee happy, it's also about setting a foundation for future work. And the trap, I think, and this is the one I'm probably the most guilty of falling into, is the light at the end of the tunnel trap, right? You get to a point where you're, you know, on the job market, you just want to be done. You want this to be over, you want to forget about it and put it away forever, right? And so there's a temptation to take the easy way out. At the extreme, there's a temptation to do stuff that is, you know, unethical, so making up results or fudging your results or whatever, which obviously goes without saying you should not do. Because it will come back to bite you, but also because it's the wrong thing to do. And that's not the part of the trap that I fell into, just so we're clear. This is not a confession. But I think there's also, you know, there's always a convenient way of doing things, right? You can take the easily available data set, even though it doesn't have such nice measurement, but hey, let's just get this over with, right? And you want to resist that a little bit. You want to actually invest a little bit in the future, maybe spend a little bit of extra time, go do some interviews with people. If you have to spend some time coding stuff, make the effort because it's going to pay dividends later on, right? And also, and this is the part that I think I really messed up on, document and organize, right? While you're doing your dissertation, you think you're going to remember this forever. But it's 4 years later now for me, and I've been trying to go back to one of my dissertation papers, and I cannot make head or tail of my own database, right? I don't know what those variables mean. I don't know where they came from. I don't know which file has the most updated variables. It's a mess, right? And that's not something I thought about while I was doing my dissertation, and I wish I had. Also, you know, often you'll end up using this data to collaborate with co-authors, and they're really going to need to know what you did. So the more you document it, the better it is. And finally, make backups and make many, many backups, because files get corrupted, files get lost, you're going to transfer to a different school and a different system, things will disappear. So you really do not want to put this kind of effort in and then lose out, right? And then finally, there's the reasonable amount of time where I think the trap is what I'm going to call the Kerouac fallacy, right? So the apocryphal story about Jack Kerouac is that he wrote On the Road in a period of 2 weeks. He just sort of sat down on a typewriter and banged it out in one long scroll and then cut it up, right? And I don't know if that story is true or not. What I do know is that you are not Jack Kerouac, and hopefully your dissertation is not a thinly disguised memoir of a beat road trip, right? If it is, you've got other problems. But your dissertation is going to take longer than you think it is, right? It just will, trust me, okay? Whatever you think is a reasonable amount of time that your dissertation will get done, double it, add some more time, because it is going to take that long, Okay, there's very little you can do about that because there is just a fundamental amount of uncertainty built into this process, right? You think you're going to run your regressions and it's all going to work out beautifully, but it's not, right? You're not going to get the results you expect. You're going to have to go back and rerun things and try different approaches and collect new data. And then when you're done with all of that, you're going to go to your advisor and they're going to say, that doesn't make any sense. Here's the data you really need. And you're going to have to go back and collect more data and do a completely different job of framing and read a different literature. And, you know, and so the only thing you can do is actually budget the time for all of that, right? Just whatever you think you're going to get done, just add a full bunch of time to it because it is going to take that long. Also keep in mind that, you know, it's not the only thing you're going to be doing, right? Many of you are going to be on the job market as you're completing your dissertations, and the job market is a huge time sink. So, you know, make sure that you're thinking about that, right? No, don't think, oh, I'm going to spend all my time working on the dissertation, except when I'm flying out to these places, and that's going to be it. That's not going to happen. You may have other research, right? Many people have projects with their advisors. Maybe you get an R&R. You really don't want to, you don't want to spend too much time doing other stuff, but you don't want to drop the ball on something that's already ongoing. So you may need to take time out for other research. And finally, you are going to get depressed, right? It's a hard process. It's a difficult, long process. There are going to be weeks when you just sit there thinking, why am I doing this to myself? Why didn't I listen to my mother and become a lawyer or a consultant or a doctor or a real doctor or something other, anything but this kind of sad, miserable life where I'm just sitting there typing away at this thing. And, you know, that's a temporary stage. We all go through it. We all get past it, right? But just recognize that you're not going to be chipper and productive. Well, maybe you are, in which case I feel very happy for you, but most people are not going to be chipper and productive through the process, right? So just build in lots and lots of additional time because it is going to take that long. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to say is, how do you get your dissertation done? You just do it, right? And that's not a trivial point. You know, I would say 90% of doing your dissertation is just working at it, right? Just don't get distracted, don't get disheartened, just keep plugging away. Eventually you'll get there. But you know, it may take a little bit longer, it may be harder than you think it is right now, but just keep at it, right? And the good news is you will get there. So there is actually light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Well, I'll make some comment based on this fabulous presentation, and I'll expand a few more points that I thought is really, really important. So you heard about focusing on the big story. So it goes beyond the dissertation. It's really, once you're on the job market, the first thing people ask you what you're doing, and you really need that 15 seconds of elevator pitch. And this is why the big story is so important to get people's attention. And it's really an art form, you know, what you need to develop over time. And it's almost you can test out whether your big story resonates with most of the audience or not. If you think about product development process, a lot of the company would test it out with end user and see whether end user would start to ask a lot of interesting questions. If you are a toy manufacturer, you show those prototype kits and whether they continue to talk about it in the storyline or the conversation with business. And in many ways, your big story works in a similar way. So treat that every time you engage in dialogue with your colleagues, advisors, or friends, whether they continue to ask questions. And it's an art form again, because the way you tell the story, sometimes you can elicit more questions, or you can try to put out a diarrhea and put it on sugar. You don't want the second form. You want them to continue to ask questions. And so that is one way for you to continue to develop that big storyline. In my personal experience, that big storyline doesn't emerge until I'm on the job market. And that's a bad example. But I wasn't able to get my big storyline until I basically had my entire dissertation committee sitting on one big group, 5 of us, worked out the storyline. But they were able and they were willing to invest on me because I've been putting that bit and bit over time. And when they were sitting in the same conference group, we were able to test out different storyline together. So that's how I got it done. So begins that process of how to make that story clear. I love the comment about committee is your best friend, definitely not your enemy, because in the end of the day, they were the only one who cares about where you're going to end up with a school or whatnot. So they are actually your best, biggest ally in the process. Get it done. To me, at a certain point in time, you start to really need to focus tactically what your committee really want, what your chair really want. Towards the end of several months on my run-up, finishing off my dissertation, I keep on reminding there is only one person on the planet right now who's going to read what I write, and that's the chair of the dissertation committee. So make sure towards the end, spend some time really focus on what the biggest decision maker is going to want, and get past that hurdle. Then you can do whatever you like. About getting it done every day, in strategy, we talk about your explicit strategies for you execute every day. Very similarly to our dissertation journey. It really comes down to on day-to-day, what activities that you do during the best or most productive time of the day. So if you are a morning person, you have to define right after you had your morning coffee what you're going to do right away in that first 2 hours when you're the smartest. So I make the mistake of, I'm going to reserve the day after I've gone through the email and things like that. And by the time I get through my email, I really don't have energy and creativity. So you have to reverse and reserve the time and make sure it's a discipline. And writing to me is the hardest bit. For some of you may be doing regression at a certain point, and you need to identify which is the hardest task in your skill set, and make sure you have the brightest time of the day, maybe at night, to get those done. And it's really the day-to-day activities which dictate your success. So let's open up for more Q&A.
So thanks to the organizers for inviting me to talk about this. I hope this is useful for you all. It certainly builds on what we just heard in multiple ways. And so you'll see some of the themes we've already started to touch on here again and what I'd like to share with you. So I was asked to talk about building a research pipeline. So the first thing I want to do is take issue with this idea of a research pipeline. So you see a pipeline, it's very standard, it's straight, it's smooth. You put inputs in one end and they predictably come out the other. This is not research, right? Research doesn't look like that at all. So instead of talking about a research pipeline, I'm going to talk about your research tree. So a tree is organic, it grows, it's complicated, it has many parts, it's somewhat unpredictable. And so you've all seen trees that look like this, right? This is more like research, right? You're not sure where it's going to go, it's kind of bendy, it's unpredictable, you're never quite sure where you're going to end up from where you start. So I want to talk about your research tree. So your research tree has several parts. What you're doing right now is building the roots, right? What are your foundations? As we already talked about, what's going to provide a springboard into your future research endeavors. Root growth, of course, doesn't stop when you graduate or get signed off by your committee. Root growth continues on as the foundation of your tree. Your trunk is kind of your core. This is who you are. This is where you see yourself in the literature, what's important to you, what theories you draw upon, what are the commonalities, okay? What does it all connect to? And then your branches are your various projects, right? And some branches are big and strong and a major part of the tree. And some branches are small and short and thin and stay that way. And that's okay, right? But they all connect back to your trunk. They all connect back to the commonality, to the core, to those theories and concepts that are you, okay? So ideally, you're going to develop a beautiful, blossomed, well-developed tree throughout your sort of research career. So I want to give a few, I guess, tips for how I think you can get to your tree. So my first tip is pruning is really important for the growth of your tree. Otherwise, you're going to end up with that twisted mess that we saw at the beginning, right? So you want to focus your growth. This is a purposeful growth strategy. Choosing what not to work on is just as important as choosing what to work on. You think you guys are time crunched now? Wait until you get a job. Okay, wait until some of you will have families, right? Wait until all the other things that are going to complicate your life. Time is your most crucial and scarce resource. So you need to choose how and where to apply your time and your focus and your concentration and your attention. So that's pruning. Sure, I have lots of projects that I've started and set aside, right? That's not important enough. That's not going to be the home run that I want to focus my time on. And it's really important to feel okay with that. I have a notebook full of those things, right? That's okay. Some of them I'll go back to when the right circumstances come up or the right co-author comes up or the right data comes up. Some of them I'll never go back to, like the third chapter of my dissertation. So you need to prune aggressively. And then reinforce those branches that are important, right? Reinforce those ones that you do want to grow. So look for opportunities to pursue additional related research questions. So how do you figure out what those are, right? To me, you figure out what those are by talking to people, by reading literature, by seeing the connections between what you're doing and what other people are doing. Tell people about what you're doing. Pay attention to the questions they ask you in response. What do they think is cool about it? What questions do they ask you that you can't answer yet? That's a research topic, right? And if it fits with your tree, that's a place to build. That's a place to reinforce that branch. And then find ways to recombine your data, as we've already been talking, to answer other research questions. And maybe this is working with co-authors. Maybe it's you set it aside for a few years and then something else comes to you, and that's a way to reinforce a branch. So that's pruning. Watering is the other important thing. So how are we going to feed the growth of that tree? So Aseem described cases where co-authors were part of this growth for him, right? Either new projects or new energy coming into those projects. Be careful with co-authors, though. Not all co-author relationships are beneficial. Be careful. Okay, just because someone has cool data doesn't mean you want to work with them. And just because they think your data is cool doesn't mean you want to work with them. Look for people who have very similar values in terms of what they think is important in research. Okay, what do they think is crucial for a good project? Because otherwise you're going to be beating each other up about which direction the project should go, and it becomes a major time sink instead of something that's helping you to build your tree. Secondly, I have sort of joined the discussion. This is just be involved in that research community that you're speaking to. So maybe this means going to those small targeted conferences. Maybe it means joining a reading group of peers with interested research sort of interests. Maybe it means just sharing your work with other people, you know, going to the seminars, going to talks. Expose yourself to ideas. Okay, so that you can find those linkages and rejuvenate your research and move your topics forward. And then keep your eyes open for any events, opportunities that give you a chance to do a project that you're interested in. So for me, I do a lot of work in renewable energy and policy and things like this. So policy changes that affect a bunch of firms, hey, that's cool, right? Or I do some work on sustainability. So, you know, California tells all these utilities that they need to start reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. They don't do this in other states. Like, that's a cool research opportunity for me. So really track those things. Just pay attention and think about how you can use those to further your research. I want to say a few words about ethics, and Aseem already talked about this a little bit with respect to your dissertation. Obviously, this continues in all of your research endeavors. And all I can say most fundamentally is maintain your own highest standards. Do things in the most robust, transparent, and honest way possible. That's the way to get ahead in this field. Do cutting-edge, interesting research and do it well. Hold yourself to that highest standard at all times, and it will serve you well. Be warned that copying your own published work, so if you're working in these related areas and, you know, I'm using the same data set or I'm using the same survey, I just want to copy and paste that out of my first paper, that's copyright infringement once you publish that paper. So you need to be really careful about not infringing on your own work that you've now assigned the copyright to a journal. And to be a respected part of your research community is really important in this job. Okay, I'm approaching tenure really quick. Well, I'm hoping I'm approaching tenure. I'm approaching my tenure decision really quickly. And so much of that is driven by, yes, of course, your research, but also just, are you a respected member of this community? Are you seen as a contributor? And that is driven by your research and your research quality. It's also driven by being part of that discussion that's going on, but it's also just driven by being a nice person. Be respectful, right? Hold up those standards of integrity to be a respected member of the community. Okay, so back to the tree. So what shape is your tree? So all this pruning and watering is shaping the tree that you're going to develop. So trees come in different shapes, right? We can have a really wide, broad tree with many big branches pointed off in different directions. We can have really narrow trees with tightly clustered branches, or we can have kind of a central palm with a few things shooting out, right? And I'm sure there are other varieties here as well. These are all fine. There's no one right shape of your tree. But the point is you need to be purposefully shaping your tree. My husband owns his own company. He's what I always call a real entrepreneur in the sense that he started his company. It's small, it's growing. You've never heard of it, I promise. And so he says to me, you know, academia is like entrepreneurship with a steady paycheck. Because you get to work on whatever you want to. I mean, if I ever fall into that trap when I'm feeling down of complaining about what I'm working on, he's like, well, you chose to work on that, right? You get to work on whatever you want. If you're not invigorated by the research you're doing, well, first of all, take a break, right? This happens to all of us. But if it's a long term, you're not invigorated by your research, you're not researching the right things, right? You need to find that thing that gives you that energy that you have the drive to work on. So in terms of the shape of your tree, you know, like I said, craft it purposefully. What interests you about your projects? So be reflective about, why am I interested in this? What is it about this research question that got me interested, and why is it driving me? Where are the commonalities? What is my trunk? Right? How are these various things that I'm working on and that I'm going to be working on in the near future, how are they all connected? That will give you a clue into what motivates you. And then what are those biggest outstanding questions that drive from that motivation? This actually took me a long time, and I have to say I struggled with it. So I came out of the BPP program at Berkeley. You come out of the BPP program and you have never been in a strategy class, ever. So when you go and join a strategy department, it's like, oh, I should be doing strategy research. And so you start trying to think of research topics that are about firm performance or something like that, instead of, you know, everything else that you've been doing. And so for the first few years of my career while I was at Emory, I tried to be a strategy person in a very narrow sense of what I thought that meant. And I was really frustrated with my research. It didn't resonate with me at all. I was very frustrated with what I was able to do with the projects that I was working on. And it wasn't until I really sat down and started thinking about what motivates me in each of these different projects that I do like, that I started to see the commonalities and started to figure out what I was actually interested in. And now that I've kind of refocused my research around that, which is much more public policy motivated, I can pick new projects appropriately. I know which branches to prune and which branches to reinforce, and I'm much happier with where I'm going. So my suggestion is write your research statement, and by that I mean the thing that will go into your tenure packet. Write that now. Okay, write that now. And what is that? That's who you are. This is what my research is about. Here's a project, and here's how it connects to that big story, the big picture we were just talking about. Here's how my projects relate to each other. Here's my contribution to the literature. And revisit that statement every year. Have that statement in your head. That's how you choose what to prune and what to reinforce, because you're building that tree that is you. Your research statement is you, right? So be very clear about what that is and what that isn't. And finally, again, related to the conversation we just had, how do you maintain your motivation in this field? Your work will get rejected. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. It will get rejected, probably many times, okay? So you have to stay motivated in light of the fact that most of the feedback you're going to get in this career is negative, right? It's not that often that people will tell you how brilliant your work is. They might say it really quickly before they launch into all the things that's wrong with it. Right? Most of the feedback you'll get, hopefully it's constructive, but it's generally what's wrong with your work. Okay, so you have to be ready for that, and you have to stay motivated. Well, you really have to find your own way to stay motivated, because I think this is different for everyone. So for some people, this is having co-authors to kind of digest the feedback with, right? Who do you go to and talk it through and figure out what to do with it? Or if not co-authors, other peers that have common values to you that you can digest the feedback with. I think a big part of staying motivated, at least for me, is working on those topics that you think have value. And so that you don't need all that positive reinforcement from the outside, because you have intrinsic motivation to keep that going, and you understand how it connects to your work and why it's meaningful to you. And then building up your life outside of your job, whatever that is for you. If you have hobbies, if you have religious ties, if you have your family, whatever that is, you're going to need them. Okay, because there will be those times when you got 2 rejections in one day, and none of your results are working out, and you don't think you have a future in this, and why did you throw however many years you have been working away at this job anyway? So you need those people, you need those hobbies. I will stop there.
I think Kira and I have perfectly complementary presentations. Maybe yin and yang, right brain, left brain. I'm not sure what the appropriate metaphor is, but we will talk differently about this. What I want to do is sort of carve out a little bit, make some statements about the nature of the problem. I think first of all, we need to highlight the fact that the purpose of building a research pipeline is, why are we interested in this problem? To get tenure, right? It's about getting tenure. So there are characteristics of that problem that I think are worthwhile mentioning, and then characteristics of papers themselves to talk about in order to get the implications about how you accomplish this goal. So this is the process of developing a paper. This doesn't include the actual research itself. This is just the paper development process. Papers have kind of a life cycle. They start with a draft, go through working paper, conference presentation, journal submission, revision, conditional acceptance, and forthcoming article. So that's the nature of a paper. I'll come back to the reason for displaying this in a second. This is my view of a pipeline, and I would agree with Kira that this is not a rational, clearly easy to scope out process. There's a lot of variation and uncertainty around it, and so I took seriously the product development model as a way to talk about it. And you can see there's sort of stage gates at different points in time where the paper is rejected. So the first question I want to ask is, how many do you need in the first stage to get tenure? I used to work for a man at the University of Connecticut, Jack Viga, who had this model. He had statistics associated with it. And he could predict, based on the number of papers underway at the point that person took the job, whether that person would get tenure. So how many papers do you need? How many? What does it take to get tenure in a top school? Anybody? What's the goal? 6, 8? 6, 8 journals. Is that the metric that's relevant to other people? 6, 4, 7? So how much time is there to do this? 4 to 7 years, depending on how you want to count it. So how many papers do you need to start with to the front of the pipeline to get to 6 publications in, let's say, 6 years as an average, given the stage gates, given the rejection probabilities? How many papers do top scholars have underway at any given moment in time, do you think? Maybe we could go around the room. Xavier, how many papers do you have underway?
Depends what you mean underway.
Well,
6 or 7.
in this sense, how many drafts? How many, 6 or 7? Melissa? 4 or 5. Interesting. Kira?
I'd say 4 or 5, yeah.
Including drafts?
Yeah, maybe 6 or 7. Depends on how good it has to be a draft. But
My guess it might be, well, my guess in terms of the numbers required, depending on how good you are, of course, the probability of acceptance plays a big role in this number, but it might be closer to 10, 12. I know one scholar has, at any point in time, has at least 15 papers going on. That's their standard for performance. So you need a lot of variation to deal with the uncertainty in the process. That's the basic point. This is what we're trying to get to. There are a couple of things that help this process, and that one of which is the fact that there are different types of papers, and there are different ways to go about working a topic. So this is, I recognize this is a hyper-rational description of reality, so it may not be the tree metaphor doesn't apply to this. It's more of a description of the different types of papers, the ways you can go with an idea. You can build a portfolio in a number of different ways. But if we're confronted with a problem where we have a need for lots of papers in the beginning of the pipeline in order to overcome the hurdle for tenure, we need to start a lot of papers, but we want to avoid lack of focus. How do we go about that? One way is to think about this scenario, that you can take a topic and work a number of different papers out of it, doing different things with it. So classically, this is the way a topic might unfold. Starts with a review paper. So if you want to study strategic planning, you start by reviewing the literature of strategic planning and publish that in JOM, or target JOM for that paper. Then you do a deductive theory paper. What kind of inferences can be done with existing literature and logic to tell you what the gaps are and that you might be able to fill. Then maybe an inductive theory paper to kind of explore the causal mechanisms around that problem, to get underneath some of the more richer causality or processual links between the variables you want to study. Then a theory testing paper, and then finally maybe a deductive or inductive theory paper to explain what you didn't find, or the inconsistencies or the anomalies or the other things you found on the theory testing expedition that didn't prove right. So you can build a portfolio that remains focused by thinking about these different types of papers and then working the number problem that way. So a couple of observations and implications. I think most of this doesn't deviate a great deal from what Kira said. I think it's at least consistent with it. The first observation is that randomness plays a role at all stages of review. What are the sources of randomness in the process? What creates randomness in the review process?
Reviewers?
Selection of reviewers. Probably the most important, we'll talk a little bit about this later, probably the most important decision an editor makes is the selection of reviewers. So you don't really get to influence that as an author. That becomes a source of randomness, at least from your perspective. Other sources of randomness?
Co-author's behavior.
Co-author's behavior, right. In terms of the length of time it takes to finish a paper, responsiveness of co-authors is a very important source of randomness. Editorial idiosyncrasies is another important source of randomness. What is the editor's role? Editor often takes a third or fourth reviewer kind of role, so they may be more or less inclined toward a particular topic. Change in editors in a particular journal makes a big difference. So this reinforces the idea you need this variety of stuff going on, but you have this other pull. You don't want to get unfocused. You don't want to move too far away from your tree. You do want to understand who you are. Because if you become unfocused, then you reduce your chances of acceptance. So given the increasingly rigorous selection process downstream, if you can increase your personal knowledge of the domain, if you can approach the problem of generating more papers, and in the meantime maintain your expertise, stay within your strengths as opposed to wandering outside it, then you're more likely to balance this need for variety, numbers, with the potential for negative selection. So one way to do this is launch papers at various life cycles. That's different types of papers I referred to earlier. Launch different types of papers along this kind of trajectory. And then co-authoring. So finding co-authors with complementary skills but working in the same domain. I agree with Kira about defining your domain is really important early on, trying to stick within that, modify it as you go along. But that domain will govern very much how you choose co-authors. To the extent you walk away from your focus, you move into domains where you don't have expertise, you reduce chances of acceptance. And I want to emphasize that there's a big pull in that direction. I think as you go out with your dissertation, to try to use that as a foundation to publish, build a pipeline, the temptation will be to engage in opportunistic co-authoring, opportunistic research, if you want to put it that way. Someone calls you in because you've done this method before. It's in a totally different topical area, but you're going to get engaged because that builds the pipeline. I think the way to avoid that is to think about what kind of different papers can I write? How can I write different life cycles of my project? How can I co-author with people working in the same topic area, or at least within the same domain, who has complementary skills?